Good afternoon, and welcome to this latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum Summer Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I briefly want to cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll probably take about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A and end at about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated but not expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I mentioned at the opening, we do have a social media channel, a YouTube channel that we record our talks, including this one. It can be accessed through the icon at the top of the website. And then fourth and finally, you can send me any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, and someone I'm really thrilled to have. Peter Owen served as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps for over 20 years. His first book, To the Limit of Endurance, A Battalion of Marines in the First World War, received the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation's prestigious General Wallace M. Green Jr. Award. Dr. Owen majored in history at the U.S. Naval Academy and earned his PhD in war studies from the Royal Military College of Canada. He and his wife live in Fairport, New York. Today, Pete is going to discuss his latest book, Fighting Falcons, the campaigns of VMF-221 in the Pacific, which provides new insight into how marine aviation functioned at the squadron level. The book offers a valuable perspective on one of the Marine Corps' notable fighter squadrons and the larger story of how the U.S. fought and learned its way to victory in the Pacific. The reviews, not surprisingly, have all been outstanding. I'm just going to read two. Barrett Tillman, the author of One Yankee Station and Dragon's Jaw, writes, Lieutenant Owen provides a thoroughly professional account of Marine Fighter Squadron's 221 career from establishment in 41 to the end of World War II, both ashore and afloat. His depth of research is exceptional, with impressive blending of primary and secondary sources. Squadron history seldom matched the standard of fighting Falcons. And Michael Fink, who's actually spoken for us and is a friend of the forum, writes, a masterful blend of unit history and operational analysis. Colonel Owen brings the reader on a journey from Midway to Tokyo, highlighting the growing pains, contributions, and context of Marine Corps aviation during some of the most critical moments in the Pacific War. I would just echo both these. It's wonderfully researched and really brings it alive. And with that, I'm thrilled to have Pete, and I'll turn it over to him.
All right, Greg, thank you so much for having me on. This is really thrilling. I've watched my good friend Dr. Arthur Galoxon present on here a couple of times. I know your audience is very well read and has some really thoughts, really good provocative thoughts and questions at the end typically. So I'm looking forward to that. So I'm going to go through this slide presentation very quickly. Probably take about 40 minutes to go through here and kind of give you a teaser for the book. Hopefully get you interested in this and set us up for a good discussion later on. But you'll see the cover of the book there. As Greg mentioned, I was an infantry officer, but a Marine for over 20 years, and Marine Corps aviation is always something I was fascinated about. So I wanted to research it. And you'll see here, the guy on the left there, that's Alfred A. Cunningham. He was the first aviator in the Marine Corps. And I've got a quote from his congressional testimony there back in the early part of the 20th century, in which he said, the only excuse for any organization to have aviation is to support troops on the ground. And that's really been kind of a Marine Corps attitude, that everybody in the Marine Corps is there to support the riflemen up front. And this was the attitude that the Marine Corps certainly embraced leading up until World War II. But I wanted to look at Marine Corps aviation in World War II from the aspect of, that's not really true. That's not really how Marine Corps aviation was utilized in the Pacific War. It certainly was used to strafe enemy troops on the ground and drop bombs on enemy positions in front of the landing force in these amphibious assaults. But about 5 times more than that, they were doing other stuff to support the fleet. So I picked this squadron because this squadron, VMF-221, the Fighting Falcons, was a great through line of Marine Corps aviation. They were formed up before Pearl Harbor in 1941. They were at the Battle of Midway, they were at the Solomons, and they were aboard a carrier during 1945. And it shows the versatility of Marine Corps aviation. So I mentioned before they were formed up in 1941. So on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Marine Corps had only 13 squadrons. And like a lot of organizations in World War II, Marine Corps aviation was going to have this period of rapid expansion. And so from 13 squadrons in December of 1941, the Marine Corps will eventually deploy 98 squadrons to the Pacific. 40 of those will be what they called fighting squadrons, which had fighter aircraft. And this is going to impact VMF-221 story in a lot of ways. Now, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Marine Corps was spread out over the Pacific. So this is what they called Fleet Marine Force. Eventually, they would call it Fleet Marine Force Pacific. You'll see way out there on the western side of the Pacific, there's a tiny legation guard in China. The 4th Marine Regiment is on Corregidor in the Philippines. There's a small Marine barracks in Guam. There's a defense battalion and part of VMF 211 on Wake Island. The 6th Defense Battalion is on Midway. There's a dive bomber squadron aboard USS Lexington on its way to Midway. There's detachments from 1st Defense Battalion on Johnston Island and Palmyra, the 3rd and 4th Defense Battalions, and the rest of the Marine Aircraft Group 21 are in Hawaii. And then 2nd Marine Division is forming up in California, and that's where our squadron is, because they just formed up at San Diego in July of 1941. Well, after the attack on Pearl Harbor and after Wake Island falls, the only Marine Corps aviation left in the Pacific are the 2 squadrons that weren't wiped out in those 2 actions, and that's VMSB 231 aboard Lexington and our heroes VMF 221 in San Diego. So they both wind up on Midway to defend that outpost. Now, as the Marine Corps is expanding very rapidly, the Marine Corps is making new air squadrons. Now, when VMF 221 got to Midway, most of their pilots were very experienced. Some of them had been flying for 10 years. All of them had been flying for well over a year, usually over 2 years. But those guys start getting pulled off Midway to form new squadrons throughout the Pacific, and new 2nd lieutenants right out of flight school start showing up at Midway. So you'll see this quote. This is from Rusty Rowell, the general on the left, who's in charge of Marine aviation in the Pacific. And his boss is Bull Halsey, Admiral William F. Halsey, the guy on the right there, who at this point of the war is in charge of all naval aviation in the Pacific. And he says, hey, listen, if you want more aviators in Midway, I've got these half-baked flyers. I can send them to Midway. And that's what happened. So by the time of the Battle of Midway, VMF 221 has gone from a very proficient and lethal fighter squadron to really a training squadron that has a lot of very inexperienced pilots. Now, some of the guys that are there for the Battle of Midway are up here on your slide right now. On the left-hand side, that's the squadron commander, Major Floyd Parks. He didn't even get there until April. And he was a Naval Academy graduate, former enlisted sailor, kind of a skirt chaser, kind of a ne'er-do-well, not a rule follower, but a pretty aggressive fighter pilot. The guy in the middle, well-known in Marine Corps aviation history, Captain Marion Carl. He'll end up retiring as a 3-star general, one of the outstanding Marine Corps fighter pilots of World War II, a test pilot after the war. And the guy on right is in charge of all the Marine aviation on Midway. So that's 2 squadrons, the Dive Bomber Squadron and VMF 221. That's Ira Kimes, and he'll be the one deciding how to employ VMF 221 during the Battle of Midway. Now, he had just replaced this guy, William Wallace. Now, I put Wallace's picture up here because I want to talk about Wallace's influence on how Marine Corps fighting aviation was utilized in the early part of World War II. So he had given a lecture at Quantico, where the Marine Corps trains its officers on fighting aviation, and it's really kind of what you It's not doctrine, but it's the closest thing to doctrine that the Marine Corps had. And he said Marine fighters are used in one of two ways: general support and special support. So if I use my fighters to escort bombers or as combat air patrol over a task force or just flying over a base to protect a base, that's special support. But if I unleash them to go find the enemy and go after them, that's general support. And he advocated general support. Use the fighters to go after the enemy aircraft. Don't tether them to special support. He was a big proponent of this, and his influence probably had a big factor in how Ira Kimes, the Marine Corps Aircraft Group Commander on Midway, utilized VMF-221 in the coming battle. Now, the guy on the left, you'll know, that's Admiral Chester Nimitz. He's the commander of the Pacific Fleet. And as he's getting ready for the Battle of Midway there in May of 1942, he gives these two planning memorandums to the guys on the right. So the guy in the top right, that's Milo Dremel, that's his chief of staff. The guy in the bottom right, that's Arthur C. Davis, that's Nimitz's air officer. And basically what he's saying is, hey, I want Marine Corps aviation, all the aircraft on Midway really, which includes by the time of the battle, Army aircraft, PBY Catalinas, half a squadron of Navy torpedo bombers. He says, I want them to go all out for the carriers. Let them leave the anti-aircraft guns on Midway to take care of the Japanese strike. But let's wait the main effort. Let's go all after the carriers. So that's what Nimitz wants. But that language isn't seen in the actual operations order that his fleet, that he issues to the commander of the Naval Air Station at Midway. So as far as Kimes is concerned, he's going off Marine Corps doctrine. He never heard anything, as far as I can tell, about going all out for the carriers. So when the Japanese strike is inbound, probably the first thing that happens, the first major action on the historic day, the Battle of Midway, is that VMF-221 intercepts the incoming Japanese strikes. They had 28 aircraft on the island. They got 26 fighters in the air, which is a really good performance from a maintenance standpoint. And all 26 went after the Japanese strike. None of them escorted the bombers. And they're outnumbered, but they don't hesitate. They go in and they're attacking. You'll see on the right-hand side, they're divided up into 5 different divisions. All 5 divisions, all 26 of these fighter aircraft plunge in, even though they're outnumbered, because there's 108 Japanese carrier airplanes coming in on this strike. 36 of them are Zero fighters, which are, faster, more maneuverable, and their pilots are more experienced. And VMF 221 does not perform well in this engagement, unfortunately. They're brave, but they don't perform well. Meanwhile, VMSB 241, they had been called 231, their name has changed now. 241 launches along with all those Army Air Force bombers and the Navy torpedo bombers to go after the Japanese carriers without any fighter escort. And all of these Navy, Marine, and Army bombers that are launched from Midway, when they find the Japanese fleet, not a single one of them gets a hit on any ship. So it's a very poor performance. About half the Marine Corps dive bombers are shot down. So not a great performance, not a great outcome, probably not what Nimitz was looking for. So here's a picture of the surviving pilots of VMF 221. This was taken about 6 weeks after the battle, after they had rotated back to Hawaii. And they had not performed too well, as I said before. So I put this slide to kind of give you some statistics. So they had 20 F-2A3 Buffaloes and they had 6 F-4, F-3 Wildcats that they got up in the air that day. 26 aircraft, they lost 15 of those. They lost 14 pilots. One of the pilots who was shot down managed to parachute and survive. Now they claim they shot down 9 Japanese planes. Some of you are probably familiar with John Parshall and Tony Tully and their book Shattered Sword. So in their examination of Japanese aircraft group records, they determined that VMF 221 probably shot down only 3 Japanese planes, and they lost 15 of their 26. So in sheer numbers, not a great performance. those pilots I showed you, the survivors, to a man pretty much blamed the Buffalo aircraft and the Wildcat to a degree. But Captain Philip White's comment here is pretty typical. He said just his belief that any commander that orders pilots out for combat in an F-2A3 should consider the pilot as lost before leaving the ground. Was it a fair assessment? Well, here's the two aircraft they were operating, the F-2A3 Buffalo and the F-4F Wildcat. They had F-4F-3s on Midway. Now, those of you that are familiar with where this story's going for Guadalcanal and the Solomons know that the Navy and the Marine Corps ended up achieving pretty respectable air-to-air statistics against the Zero, against the Japanese Navy in later actions with the F-4F Wildcat. But at Midway, the Marines had not performed that well. Now, was it an aircraft thing? Well, they lost 2/3 of their Buffaloes, so they only lost 1/3 of their Wildcats. So that kind of suggests, yeah, that may be it. But when you actually look at the performance statistics, the armament, how fast they climb, how fast they can go, all those different things, there's not a lot of difference between a Wildcat and a Buffalo. But when you look at the experience level of the pilots, you realize that a lot of these guys didn't have a lot of experience. So I divided them into three tiers here. So the experienced pilots in VMF-221 on 4 June had been flying for over 2 years. Six of those guys, 6 of those 11 survived. Um, Now they claimed 6 victories. That doesn't really mean much because they claimed 9. They only shot down 3, so we don't really know who shot down what. There were inexperienced guys. These are the half-baked flyers that Rusty Rowell had talked about. They'd started arriving about 15 weeks before the battle, so they had some flying experience there on Midway. They had a few more hours, and then the novices. And I think when you look down on the bottom, you can see, well, who's getting shot down? Well, the experienced pilots and the novices, almost half of them got shot down. But the half-baked flyers that had 9 to 15 weeks, 3/4 of them got shot down. What I think this says is, it's not exactly what the numbers say, but I think what it's saying is probably the most significant contributing factor to the VMF 221's poor performance at Midway was the fact that their pilots were so inexperienced. And I probably think the most significant contributing factor to VMSB 241's poor performance trying to strike the Japanese fleet was that they had no fighter escort at all. So that's my take on VMF 221 at the Battle of Midway. So they come back from that. They basically rebuild the entire squadron. All the pilots who survived get transferred to other squadrons except one. And I'll talk about him in a minute. But they keep the same ground echelon, and they're back in Hawaii, and they go through a lot of reorganization, and they really don't come together as a new unit getting ready for deployment until about November of 1942. And then we get a new squadron commander, we got a new squadron same squadron XO, and we get a bunch of pilots, and they're all going to deploy in February to the Solomon Islands. They get a lot of busy training during that time. And the guy that's kind of responsible for their first combat tour is this guy on the left. That's Captain Robert Burns. Now, Robert Burns had been one of the original fighter pilots in VMF 221, one of those experienced guys. He had about 3 years flying time when he showed up on Midway. But during the battle, he was Ira Kime's right-hand man, running fighter direction for him on the ground. So he didn't fly, so he didn't get killed. He didn't get shot down. And he stays with the squadron. And when they go to Guadalcanal, he's supposed to be the XO. But right before they get aboard the ship to go to Guadalcanal, the CO gets really, really, really sick and can't deploy with them. And Robert Burns, as a captain with only 3.5 years in the Marine Corps flying, is going to be the squadron commander for their first combat tour. I had the good fortune of getting in touch with his son himself. He's a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer. He shared this photo with me and a lot of good information about his dad. His dad was from Minnesota, went to the University of Minnesota, studied aero engineering before going to flight school. The guy in the center is Technical Sergeant Jack Pittman. So in the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy, they would sometimes take enlisted sailors or Marines and make them pilots. So they didn't call them naval aviators, they called them naval aviation pilots. Jack Pittman had been a PFC in a dive bomber squadron at Hawaii on 7 December 1941, and he had watched his squadron and the rest of Marine Corps aviation in Hawaii get destroyed on the ground. He had then volunteered for flight school. He'd become a fighter pilot, and he'll be one of the best fighter pilots in VMF-221 in the Solomons. And then on the right-hand side, you see two very good friends who are wingmen, uh, First Lieutenant Harold Murderous Manny Seagal and Captain Jimmy Sweat. And they both get shot down on the same day. Very harrowing escape stories separately in the Solomons. And I'm going to talk about Jimmy Sweat in particular here in a minute. But the squadron gets there in February of 1943. They start their first combat tour in March of 43. And they're based at Guadalcanal. So by this time, the historic Battle of Guadalcanal has been won. So Guadalcanal is secure. And now Admiral Halsey is now in charge of the South Pacific area as the commander of the Third Fleet. And his job is to drive from southeast to northwest to isolate and reduce the Japanese fortress of Rabaul up there on New Britain. So the way that they're going to do that is they're going to do a series of amphibious operations to get their aircraft closer and closer to Rabaul. So you see the dashed lines that I've drawn. Those are the combat radii of the Marine VMF-221's fighter aircraft in each of their 3 combat tours across 1943. So for their initial combat tour, they're stationed at Guadalcanal on Fighter 1 and Fighter 2 near Henderson Field, and they're flying F-4, F-4s. So with drop tanks, they can only get as far as that first dashed line. Their second combat tour, they'll be flying out of the Russell Islands from a place called Banneker. By then they'll have Corsairs. They can cover not only all of New Georgia, but the southern part of Bougainville. And then for their final tour, they'll be out of Barracoma on Vella La Vella. They'll be able to cover all of Bougainville, getting almost all the way to Rabaul. So what Halsey's trying to do here as he advances up is basically, it's a repeating process. So first, aircraft gain and maintain air superiority. And then once I have air superiority, I can move my ships in and I can establish sea control. And once I've established sea control, I can bring my landing force in, I can assault the landing, capture an airfield, and then use that airfield to gain and maintain air superiority over the next objective. And it's a repeating process all the way up through the Solomons. It's what MacArthur's doing in the Southwest Pacific area as he moves west across New Guinea. So during the first combat tour, here's where they are at Fighter 1. So pretty rudimentary airstrip, even now, even after, Marines have been on Guadalcanal for 6 months now. This is where they're maintaining their aircraft. And these are probably aircraft that the squadron falls in on. Now, one thing that was kind of curious to me is when this squadron gets there in the South Pacific, instead of taking the fighter aircraft, the Wildcats they brought with them, and the ground crew that they brought with them that have been maintaining those aircraft and bringing them with them to Guadalcanal, what the Marine Corps does is they put all the pilots on a transport down in Espiritu Santo in the rear area, and they just fly them up to Henderson Field, and they just fall in on the aircraft and the ground crew that happens to be there, and they start flying their combat missions. So they are involved in 2 very large air-to-air combats, and this map that I drew is the second one. This is called Operation Igo. What's going on at this point is Halsey is building up his supplies, his forces, and his logistics. So when he goes into New Georgia, it's not going to be a shoestring operation like Guadalcanal was. He wants to mass his combat power, have all his supplies, have all his naval, air, and ground forces so that the issue will never be in doubt. So he's doing Operation Dry Goods, the buildup of supplies. What Admiral Yamamoto tries to do is disrupt that and buy time by sinking supplies and bombing supply depots ashore. So he launches a rather large airstrike, over 100 aircraft, almost 200 aircraft, This is all naval aviation, so he's stripping air groups off his carriers to come down here, launch out of Rabaul and nearby airfields, and strike this buildup of forces on Guadalcanal. Well, obviously, we have really good, the Americans have really good fighter direction, and they have coast watchers spread all through the Solomons. So they know this strike is coming. And Fighter Command Solomons is able to mass all of its fighters in the air. And a big chunk of those fighters they get up are VMF-221, and they're Wildcats. On the right-hand side of the slide, what you'll see is Jimmy Sweat being presented the Medal of Honor a few months later for his actions on this date. So I'm not going to go through step by step this aerial action. I do that in the book, though, and it's really fascinating because they have a really good log of all the radar intercepts they have, so you can kind of put yourself in the viewpoint of the Marine fighter directors on Guadalcanal and see what they're seeing by what their radar operators and the coast watchers are telling them. And they're trying to track and decipher what this Japanese strike looks like and where it's going to be and what they need to do with their fighters. So when they realize this large group of dive bombers is heading towards Tulagi anchorage, where there's a lot of ships, they vector Jimmy Sweat, 2 divisions, including Jimmy Sweat, who's leading one of the divisions, to intercept them over Tulagi. And they get there right as the Val dive bombers are starting to go into their dives. Sweat doesn't hesitate. He's a little bit ahead of everybody else, the other 7 aircraft, and he plunges right in and dives with the dive bombers, trying to shoot them down. Now, in his personal accounts, he's credited with 7 and 1 probable victories shooting down. That's an incredible feat of airmanship. What he's probably really accomplished was he shot down between 3 and 5. At least that's what the analysis by a great author named Rick Dunn, who wrote a book called South Pacific Air War, what he's able to figure out by looking at Japanese air group records is that Sweat probably shot down no more than 5. But still, that's amazing. And plus, what he's doing, of course, is disrupting this Japanese attack as they're going after the ship. So this is the highlight. This is the biggest, most severe combat that VMF-221 encounters. And then they stay on Guadalcanal and fly more combat missions until early May. Then they get a break. They get to go to Australia for R&R for about a week. Then they come back to Espiritu Santo, and when they get there, they get Corsairs. So they get the F4U-1s, and they get about 6 weeks, well, really about a month of intensive training to learn to fly their new aircraft that they're going to be operating in the South Pacific. And then they go up to the Russell Islands, and you'll see there on the right, that's the airstrip they fly from at Banneker. And they're going to be there to cover the New Georgia amphibious assault. So the assault on New Georgia in the central part of the islands, really rough time for the landing force. And it's supported by Marine Corps radar. One incident that happens there on like about the 2nd, 3rd, 4th day of the amphibious assault is VMF-221 and their Corsairs are flying over the central part of the Solomons, protecting the amphibious task force from Japanese airstrikes. And there's a thing called New Georgia Air Force. It's a Marine Aviation Command that's landed there on Rendova, right near New Georgia. And their job is to control the air fight to protect the task force and push air support up to the troops on the ground. And there's a tragedy of errors that happens. So you see there on the left, that's an SCR-268 radar. So the Marines have 4 radars there on Rendova to help this New Georgia Air Force see the air picture. Well, a couple of them haven't been set up yet, and one of them is offline because it's being refueled. And then another one, they had tried to refuel it that day, and there was a drum of gasoline apparently marked. It was marked gasoline, but it was apparently diesel, so they put diesel in the gasoline generator and took that offline. So they've got no radar coverage. And at the same time, there's a thunderstorm coming in. And Admiral Mark Mitcher, who's in charge of all aviation in the Solomons at this point, says, hey, let's pull our flyers out. I don't want them to be in danger from this thunderstorm. And New Georgia Air Force, the Marines say, are you sure you want to do that, Admiral? It's like, yes, do it. And like, are you sure? And like, they say this 3 times. It goes back and forth. Finally, yeah, pull the combat air patrol out. So VMF-221 goes back to the Russells. Shortly thereafter, about 27 Japanese Betty bombers come in and strike the task force, kill about 70 soldiers, sailors, and Marines. So not a great day, but it shows the interrelationship between command decisions and radar and amphibious landings and fighter protection, and how it all kind of had to work together to work out correctly. And then on their third combat tour, this is the invasion of Bougainville. So they're flying for about a month before the assault, trying to gain and maintain air superiority over Bougainville. This picture is taken the day before D-Day. They're at Vella. They're flying there along with Pappy Boyington's VMF-221, and they're involved in a lot of different air-to-air actions during this time. Now, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of the entire Solomons campaign, which came to a head during their third combat tour here while they're at Vella, is how difficult it was to keep aircraft flying in the Solomon Islands at this part of the war. So there's supply chain issues where they're not getting enough parts. There's organizational mismanagement on part of both naval aviation and Marine Corps aviation. And there's just plain miserable conditions. You're at the end of a very long supply chain. You're operating in very, very difficult tropical conditions. The pilots and the ground crew are not immune from all of those tropical diseases that are, well known for taking guys off the fighting line. So it's very difficult to keep these aircraft flying. The guy on the right there, that's Major Nathan Post. So there's a different squadron commander for each one of these three combat tours in the Solomons. He's this commanding officer for this third combat tour. And you can see there something he wrote in one of his after mission reports where he says that, hey, this is what's going on, is we're flying pilots and they're falling in on whatever aircraft happen to be there. And the guys working on them are just the guys that happen to be on that airstrip. There's no continuity between the maintainers and the pilots and the aircraft. They're using them almost as interchangeable parts. He says there's no logs for the aircraft, so we don't know which ones need. There's aircrafts that have been, the engines have been going for 1,800 hours and they're supposed to have an overhaul at 800 hours. There's airplanes that can't get up high enough because the oxygen doesn't work. They get in dogfights and the guns don't work. They have to abort because the engines won't draw fuel, or the gas tanks won't draw fuel. So what he concludes with is apparently the newest planes in this area are used for training in the rear, and the oldest ones are left in the combat area until they can't fly anymore. So down on the bottom, you'll see, well, how does that impact combat performance? Post has plenty of pilots and they're really good. His squadron has plenty of aircraft, but they're not flying. So he's only getting combat hours per day. He's only getting about 37 with the Corsair, whereas they were getting about 54 combat hours per day for the squadron when they were flying the Wildcat. And sorties means one aircraft taking off to fly one mission. And that's, he's only getting 13 and a half sorties per day for a squadron that rates 18 aircraft. That's not good. Also, so how well were they doing in action against the Japanese? Well, if you believe American claims, they were doing really well. This squadron ends up shooting down the second most of any squadron in the Second World War. They claimed a 77 in the Solomons. But I looked at the 17 actions in which they had aerial victories claimed, and then I looked at the total number of U.S. claims in those actions. And then I looked at Rick Dunn's book and I said, well, how many did the Japanese actually lose in those 17 actions? And it ends up, they're only actually turning out to about 35% of American losses are valid. I mean, American claims are validated by actual Japanese losses. So I expected it to be different, but I didn't expect it to be that bad. All right, and then the last part of the book for me was fascinating because they put this Marine squadron aboard an aircraft carrier. And the reason the Navy does that is towards the end of 1944, the US fleet is now starting to get hit by these Japanese suicide attacks. And with the Japanese fleet on its hind legs, they realize, we really don't need so many torpedo and dive bombers, and we really need a lot more fighter aircraft. And the only fighter aircraft they had available were all these Marine Fighting Squadrons, 221 had actually gone back to California because the Pacific Fleet didn't have enough work for it. So what they do is they take 10 squadrons, including 221, they qualify them to fly off carriers, and they add 2 Marine Fighting Squadrons to 5 each of the new Essex class carriers that are out there in the Pacific. And so 221 does its 1945 combat tour aboard USS Bunker Hill. The guy on the left is the squadron commander for this combat tour. That's Major Edwin S. Roberts. I had the fortune of getting in touch with his children, and his daughter-in-law Judy gave me a copy of his diary, which is full of really wonderful detail. The guy in the middle, Dean Caswell, new second lieutenant, joined the squadron before this deployment, ends up being the Marine Corps' leading carrier ace with 7 victories credited to him. He also became rather famous in the Marine Corps, retired as a colonel, did a lot of post-career interviews for historians. Unfortunately, he passed away before I could interview him myself, but he and his buddies would get together at reunions, and they compiled a great privately published compilation of war stories, which I was able to leverage for my book. One of the guys who contributed a lot to that work was the guy on the right. That's Lieutenant Robert Glendinning, and he tells good stories, has a lot of harrowing stories. So here's Task Force 58. Bunker Hill joins that in February 1945. And what the fighter aircraft are being used for is what's called the Big Blue Blanket. So each one of these silhouettes represents a division of 4 Corsairs or Hellcats. So what they do is above the carrier task group, they've got aircraft in divisions staggered all the way up. And then outside the limit of anti-aircraft fire, they've got another division down on the surface to intercept guys, trying to sneak in under the radar. And then about 40 miles out, they'll have a picket station, a Tomcat they call it, where they've got radar and they've got fighter aircraft over the top, and the Tomcat destroyer will direct the fighters to intercept any aircraft they come across. And then over the enemy airfield, they'll start off the operation by doing a fighter sweep, and then they'll try and keep a couple divisions over each enemy airfield to kind of blanket them and keep them from taking off. And this is how the fleet's going to protect itself while it's doing operations in the Western Pacific. Their first operation is striking Japanese aircraft industry in the home islands of Japan. Of course, the Navy's not carrying as big bombs as the Army Air Force, but they're able to bomb with more precision than the Army Air Force is. So the Strategic Bombing Survey indicates they did fairly well. And now finally, Marine Corps is being involved in close air support. VMF-221 is involved along with the other Marine Fighting Squadrons and Task Force 58 during the battle for Iwo but only for 4 days. And this battle goes on for like 48 days. So it's just a small part of the air support. Most of the air support at Iwo is flown by Navy pilots, and then towards the end, the Army P-51s they brought in. And then finally is the Battle of Okinawa. So here's where VMF-221 actually gets pretty good at doing close air support, and they fly a lot of it. And both the Marine Corps and the Army and Marine Aviation and Navy Aviation all get a lot better at close air support at Okinawa, in part because the ground troops are in close proximity to the enemy in a long fight, and they're able to identify targets with more precision and then vector in the aircraft to come in and actually have effect on the targets. So this is kind of the culmination of what the Marine Corps wanted to do with aviation since A.A. Cunningham was flying his seaplane, is you've got Marine Corps aviation supporting Marine and Army troops on the ground during the Battle of Okinawa. But what they're also doing is they're doing the Big Blue Blanket to protect the fleet off Okinawa from those Japanese airstrikes and suicide attacks. And you'll see all the numbered Tomcat stations, all the pickets around Okinawa. On May 11, as an example, there's one of these massive air battles over a radar picket 15 to the northwest of Okinawa. Hugh Hadley, the destroyer in the upper right-hand corner, is right in the middle of that. They're the fighter directors. They've got radar. There's a battle. Hugh Hadley herself accounts for 27 Japanese aircraft. And Jimmy Sweat and 6 other pilots from VMF-221 are right in the middle of this air battle. Um, and then they make it back to their carrier after this, only to find Bunker Hill gets hit while they're in the waiting to land. Bunker Hill gets hit not by one, but by two suicide attacks. Now she survives. However, about 275 of her crew, including 11 ground crew Marines from VMF-221, are killed in the fire. And Bunker Hill is now out of the war. And with Bunker Hill out of the war, VMF-221's combat has ended. All right, so remember I talked about how tough it was to keep aircraft flying in the Solomons. Aboard Bunker Hill, it's a little bit of a different story. Okay, it's not an easy life being a Marine or a sailor working on aircraft aboard a carrier, but it's better than being in the South Pacific on a tropical island. And so their sortie rate is much higher, about 22 sorties per combat day uh, off Bunker Hill, which is, you know, about equivalent to what they were able to do with the Wildcat when they were on Guadalcanal. So it's a lot better performance when you're aboard a carrier. All right. So what I'm going to leave you with before we jump into the questions is, remember Cunningham saying the only excuse for any organization to have aviation and support the troops on the ground is, I think that's short-sighted. I think what VMF 221 and squadrons like it showed is that aviation is not a one-trick pony. Aviation is a very versatile tool, and it can be used to gain and maintain air superiority. It can do aerial reconnaissance. It can attack, yes, it can attack targets on the ground. And you can do a lot with aviation besides just supporting the infantry on the ground. And that's really what Marine Corps aviation did. And I think they performed extremely well once they worked the bugs out. All right, so I'm going to switch to questions. And Greg, I think we've got some time, and I'm
Yeah,
sure your guests have a couple of questions. And I
uh,
know I went through that pretty quickly, so I'm happy to slow down now.
no, that was great. Thank you very much, Pete.
Do
I
you want
think,
me to stop sharing?
sure. No, that's fine. I'll read the first one from Gary. We've got a few here. Was there any interaction between your Falcons and Pappy Boynington and his squadron of bad boys?
Yes, yes, there was. So VMF 214, VMF 213, and 221 were all part of the same Marine aircraft group that trained up in Hawaii. Pappy Boynton had nothing to do with that. They all deployed to the South Pacific at the same time. But then on their third combat tour, that's when Pappy Boynton had taken command of VMF 214. So for their third combat tour, they initially started at Munda, and then after about a week, Munda's on New Georgia, they went to Vella La Vella, to a new airfield the Seabees had just completed called Barracoma. And the first two squadrons to go there were VMF 221 and VMF 214. And folks who know about Pappy Boynton and his story know there's a couple famous instances where he was flying over the Japanese airfields on the southern end of Bougainville at Kahili, and he taunted them to try and get them to come up and fight because he knew he was up there with his Corsairs and had the altitude advantage. Well, that really happened, but it wasn't just VMF 214 up there. There was about 5 Corsairs from VMF 221, including Major Nathan Post. And it was actually 221's pilots that got some of the more significant victories in that action.
Nice. Next question from Charles asks, said, I really enjoyed the book. In Midway, you pointed out that the veteran and I guess newer pilots have about the same kill rate or the same
Right.
effect, despite the disparity in training and experience. Could you expand on that?
Sure, sure. So first off, thanks for reading the book. Um, yeah, it was like what I was expecting to see is that the experienced pilots would survive at a much higher rate than the novices. So what I actually found was like the pilots that who suffered the highest proportional losses were those guys in the middle, the guys that had come out of flight school in early 1942 and had been flying off Midway for between 9 and 15 weeks already. They actually suffered about 75% losses. The new guys who had just arrived there 7 days before the battle, and the experienced guys who had been flying for 2 years for 2 years or more, about 45% of each of those categories were lost. The only thing, this is speculative, but I would speculate that if you're an experienced pilot, but you've got an inexperienced wingman, that's going to be a very dangerous situation for you as well, because A, he's not going to be able to protect you as well as he should, and B, you may be doing things to protect him because he's making mistakes or he's not good. So it puts you also at a disadvantage. That's a guess.
Mm. Next question is from Brian. You mentioned American victory claims were validated at only about, I think you said 35%.
Right.
Typical across the Pacific War, or was VMF unusual?
I don't think VMF-221 was that unusual, but I didn't do a larger analysis.
Got it. Okay. Next question. Oh, Patrick. If they had received the Corsairs earlier, would it have significantly changed their combat effectiveness?
I think so. Yeah, they're definitely, their claim to loss ratio
Yeah.
was much higher with the Corsair and the Solomons than it had been with the Wildcats. But also the other side of that, of course, is their readiness went way down. Part of the reason the Navy went with the Hellcat and not the Corsair, aside from the fact that the Corsair is more difficult to land aboard a carrier, was that the Navy did not yet have a stockpile of spare parts for the Corsairs. And the Marines were, of course, not flying off carriers, and they were more than happy to take the Corsairs, but that lack of spare parts contributed to their low readiness rate.
Okay. Next question from Peter. Sorry, joined late. In the book, you talk about Midway as, quote, being an ideal spot to train a new squadron. Could you
Right.
comment on why that is?
Yeah, the guy who actually said that was James. No, it was Harold Bauer. So Harold Bauer was one of the original pilots that went with VMF-221 to Midway Island, and he actually says that in a letter or a diary or something. It would have been an ideal place to train a squadron if that's all you had to do, because you're isolated from distractions. You've got this airfield all to yourself, and you can just fly all you want. However, it wasn't an ideal situation because the squadron's mission was to defend Midway. So I looked through, well, what were they actually doing every day between January and June of 1942? And about 2/3 of their sorties were not training pilots how to be more lethal fighter pilots. What they were doing was doing search patrols to make sure there weren't like Japanese submarines or anybody else trying to sneak up on the island. And they were also using the Marine Aircraft Group to calibrate the anti-aircraft guns and the radars of the defense battalion, which was an important task that had to be done as well. So only about 1/3 of their sorties were devoted to actual fighter pilot training.
Got it. Steve asked, at Midway, how was it decided who flew the Buffaloes and who flew the Wildcats? I'm always surprised that Major Parks flew a Buffalo. Thanks.
Right. So the guys that flew Wildcats had already flown Wildcats before in their career. That's how they decided it. Or most of them had. The division commander and Carl were qualified in Wildcats, and they already existed as a division. So his division got the 7 Wildcats.
Got it. Next question from Jim. If Rabaul had been invaded instead of isolated, how different might the campaign have been?
I think the decision to bypass Rabaul was an absolutely good one, because Rabaul had a lot of Japanese servicemen there. Maybe not a whole lot of infantry, but a lot of Japanese servicemen, naval, army, whatever. And it's very rugged. It would have consumed a lot of combat power. There would have been heavy losses. It would have taken a long time. And as the campaign proved, bypassing it was sufficient. So once you had land-based aviation in close proximity to Rabaul, the Japanese were unable to effectively use it as an air base. And since they couldn't use it as an air base, they couldn't use it as a naval base either. So it was effectively neutralized.
From Victor, really enjoyed the book. Just curious your thoughts. How important was Halsey's step-by-step island campaign compared with MacArthur's advance through New Guinea? Could one have succeeded without the other?
Um, that's a good question. Both of them used basically the same technique where they bypassed some islands, but they had to take some because they had to get a new airfield that extended the range of their land-based aviation. So they were both essentially doing the same thing. The advantage of having two parallel offensives, one by MacArthur and one by Halsey, was that it forced the Japanese to divide their defensive forces. In other words, they couldn't defend both with all their force. They had to divide and defend against both. Of course, the disadvantages to the Americans and their New Zealand and Australian allies was that, well, they had to divide their offensive power as well between two flag officers, right? And they had to build up two redundant systems of supply. So would one have been more effective? Like if we had just concentrated everything in the Solomons or everything in New Guinea, would that have shortened the war or lengthened it? I don't think anybody's ever done the math on that. Good
And
question.
yeah, I got a question here on the CBs. I know you referenced that in the book, but could you talk a little bit about how involved they were with the squadron?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so CBs, that's Navy construction battalions. So they are the most famous part of the base construction element in the Pacific War. But also there were Marine engineer units and there were also Army Air Force engineer units that were performing similar or the same roles. But basically, after the landing force came in and captured a Japanese airfield, the Seabees would come in and build it into an American airfield and make it a much more effective base. So they were extremely good at their job. One thing I did learn while I was researching this is the Navy basically had these prepackaged, what do they call them, like Lion and Tiger units, and basically they prepackaged them aboard amphibious assault ships, and they would have a dedicated LST that could come in and land and beach itself on the beach right next to where the airfield was going to be operating. It would already have aviation airfield equipment and supplies and fuel and things like that to get that airfield up and running. And they're just drawing supplies, equipment, personnel from that LST directly in rather than having to try and build up an organization and then start operating an airfield.
Got it. Joe asks, you talk about McCool's, I think it's pronounced McCool's. They destroyed the emergency, was it underground fuel storage at Sand Island?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So Vern McCall was the squadron commander when VMF-221 got to Midway. And then he got promoted to lieutenant colonel. So he became the XO of the Marine Aircraft Group. So he's the XO during the Battle of Midway. And part of his job is managing the fuel situation, which is something I understand very much because I was the XO of an infantry regimental combat team in Iraq. And one of my big headaches was, do we have enough fuel every day, right? So what happened was, when you really look into the Naval Air Station Midway records, it was one of the base defense battalion guns was firing, and somebody had the stupid idea of wiring all of the fuel farm with demolition charges just in case the Japanese landed. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't think they had blasting caps in here, but there was a sympathetic detonation from the test firing of the naval guns that the defense battalion had, and they basically blew up half of their fuel farm on on Sand Island, which was the main island. The Marines, VMF-221's on the airfield on Eastern Island. So that did a couple things. One, it destroyed a lot of on-hand fuel. Second off, what it did was it destroyed the pipeline that went from Sand Island across the lagoon to Eastern Island. So now all the fuel had to come in barrels, or they had to fill barrels, and then they had to put it on a barge and take it across the lagoon and unload all these barrels and then take the barrels of fuel around to the different aircraft and refuel them. Did it have any major impact on the performance of any of the aircraft during the battle? Not immediately, but it certainly was a memorable experience for all the ground crew and the Marine raiders that were pressed into surface refueling aircraft because of this.
Interesting.
Oh, and also the biggest impact was it'll reduce the number of flight hours available to train these new aviators that came in on May 27th. So that's probably the biggest impact it had.
Another follow-up from Victor. How much do you attribute the squadron success to pilot skill versus fighter direction, radar, and intelligence from the coast watchers.
Yeah, you need all of it. That's one of the things I think this story really, really explains is everything's got to be working for everything to go right. So if you don't have trained pilots, everything else can go right. Fighter direction worked great at Midway. And I don't think the aircraft were all that inferior, but they were misemployed and they weren't flown very well. In the Solomons, when everything worked, the squadron was very effective at doing its job. But when, if you had a command decision like Mitchell's to withdraw the combat air patrol, it doesn't work. If the maintenance isn't working, you can't get aircraft up in the air, it doesn't work.
Perfect. I think that's it for the queue we've got, Pete. I know we're at the top of the hour. I was just going to ask, you put a lot of research in this, and also just reading it, there was a lot of data. I mean,
Yes.
I was really, I'm impressed by everyone who writes
Thanks.
it, but there was a lot of data where it was almost like you were using it to validate or objectively support your conclusions. Could you talk about that? I mean, it was clear there was a lot of time. Yeah.
Sure. Well, it's no surprise this book is drawn from my PhD dissertation.
Yeah.
The dissertation is much more dry. There's not nearly as many, exciting seat of your pants stories. But also in the dissertation, I had 38 tables of statistics, and then those are summarized in the book, with a sentence or two. There's only, I think, 5 tables in the book. But yeah, I did a lot of research. I did a lot of Excel spreadsheets to count stuff up, and I enjoy doing that.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Actually, one final question here from Peter on, can you talk about the success at Bunker Hill and to what extent it was hindered by logistics?
Sure. So the Task Force 58 fast carriers were out there in the Pacific, and the way Mitchell's in charge of Task Force 58. So he usually had 4 task forces, sometimes 5, depending on how many carriers were operational and how many he'd lost. And he had to pull one task force off the line almost every day to refuel at sea. So this is something unprecedented in naval warfare, where the U.S. Navy is sustaining a fleet of over 1,000 warships, over 1,000 miles from its nearest base. And what they're able to do this because they're cycling refueling ships and resupply ships, and they've gotten really good at refueling at sea. But what that means is that in order to keep the carriers supplied with fuel and the aircraft supplied with aircraft fuel, that they're missing 1 day out of 6 at least to go resupply. The second thing is weather is impacting them. So out of every 6 days on their last combat tour aboard Bunker Hill, VMF-221 is not flying combat missions either because of bad weather or because they're offline refueling.
Excellent. That concludes our talk for today. Thank you to our
Cool.
speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, Fighting Falcons, the campaign of VMF-221 in the Pacific. Highly recommended. It's a great book. Please join us next Saturday, August 1st at 1 p.m. when historians Raymond Callahan and Alan Jeffries will discuss their book, Churchill's Forgotten Generals, Victors in Burma, which details the appointments of Auchinleck, Slim, and Savory in 1943, how these appointments proved pivotal to the eventual defeat of the Imperial Japanese Army in Burma. We hope you can make it then. Until then, thanks for joining us. And Pete, thanks so much for your time today. Great talk.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for all the great questions. This was really fun for me.
Likewise. Take care.
Bye-bye.